In this video, I will read The Jewish Cemetery in Newport by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow as a way to discuss the depiction of Jews as an ancient and mostly dead race in American literature before the great wave of Eastern European immigrants. Hi, I'm David. Welcome to Affiliated Identities, an introduction to Jewish American literature. Today, as I said, we'll be reading The Jewish Cemetery at Newport by Longfellow. Longfellow was one of the most popular poets of 1800s USA. His most famous poem was Song of Hiawatha, a long narrative poem loosely based on Native American stories. I won't get into biographical details, etc., because they are not very relevant to this poem. The Jewish Cemetery at Newport has a special place in Jewish American studies because it illustrates the idea some Americans had of Jews as a dead people who belonged to biblical times rather than to the contemporary United States. The speaker of the poem visits a Jewish cemetery at Newport, a coastal town in Rhode Island. In the 1600s, long before the American Revolution, Newport welcomed a group of Jews fleeing Spanish persecution. These Sephardi Jews formed one of the first Jewish communities in the New World. Eventually, the community broke up, and by the 19th century, most of what remained was physical traces, mainly the synagogue and the small cemetery that is at the center of this poem. I'm going to read the poem with some interpretation, especially stressing the depiction of Jews. The poem is a little long, so I will not interpret each and every word or dwell on every allusion, but I will read the whole thing with you. At the end, I'll say some general comments. So, the Jewish Cemetery at Newport. Already in the title, we can see a contrast between the cemetery associated with death, the end, and we may say old things, and the name of the town where the cemetery is located, Newport, an entry place for somewhere new, the new world, if you will. We might also say that ports are usually bustling places, whereas cemeteries are usually quiet. We see a kind of disconnect between the cemetery and where it is. Indeed, the poet expands on this disconnect. First thing, how strange it seems. The existence of the cemetery is weird, needs explaining, with an exclamation mark. These Hebrews in their graves puts them in the world of the Bible when they still spoke Hebrew. In the 19th century, nobody spoke Hebrew as an everyday language. And their place in the picture is in the graves, dead. From the opening line of the poem, Jews equal dead and the past. Close by the street of this fair seaport town, silent beside the never silent waves, at rest in all this moving up and down. The waves are always moving, are alive. The Jews, by contrast, are inert, never changing, dead. The trees are white with dust, that over there sleep, wave their broad curtains in the south wind's breath, while underneath these leafy tents they keep the long, mysterious exodus of death. Exodus is the escape of the people of Israel, the Bible forebears of the Jews, from slavery in Egypt. But here it is not an escape from slavery to freedom, but from life into death. It's like he is taking a story of Jewish freedom, once celebrated every Passover, and rewrites it as a story of extinction. And this sepulchral, having to do with graves, etc., stones so old and brown that pave the level flags their burial place, seem like tablets of the law thrown down and broken by Moses at the mountain's base.
Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
Again, an allusion to the book of Exodus. Moses came down from receiving the law from God on Mount Sinai. Seeing that the Israelites worship a golden calf, he shattered the original tablets on which the Ten Commandments were etched by God. Here, the stones of the cemetery remind him of these shattered tablets. The semantic field for discussing Jews remains the thousands of year old biblical story. The very names recorded here are strange. This is the second time he uses the word strange. It's not just weird to be in a cemetery. The people interred here are strangers with strange names, as if somebody with an English name is more of a native than someone with a Jewish one. All Europeans are newcomers if you think about it. Of foreign accent and of different climes, the names don't belong here. Alvarez and Riviera, an interchange with Abraham and Jacob of old times. The last names are Spanish sounding because they come from Spain. The first names, like Abraham and Jacob, are straight out of the Hebrew Bible. It's true that Jews often have biblical names, but here the speaker stresses that they belong to the old days. Blessed be God, for he created death, the mourner said, and death is rest and peace. Then added in a certainty of faith, and giveth life that never more shall cease. Closed are the portals of their synagogue. The building is there, but nobody who might use it is still alive. No Psalms of David now the silence break. No rabbi reads the ancient Decalogue in the grand dialect the prophets spake, mentioning Jewish prayers in Hebrew as something you cannot hear. It belongs to the ancient past. It's in the language, the dialect of the prophets, these ancient people. Gone are the living, but the dead remain, and not neglected, for a hand unseen scattering its bounty like a summer rain still keeps their graves and their remembrance green. How came they here? The how is more like a why, or how is it possible? I feel like this questioning, especially of they, those mysterious others, coming here emphasizes that Jews do not belong here in the New World, here in Newport. What burst of Christian hate, what persecution merciless and blind. This is an acknowledgement of violent anti-Semitism, but only such violence could bring the Jews to a place they don't really belong. What violence drove over the sea, the desert desolate? The Atlantic Ocean between Europe and America is likened to the desert of Exodus, in which the people of Israel wandered on their way to the Promised Land for 40 years. This is a trope or comparison that Christian Puritans used as they were settling North America in the 17th century. It's a very old comparison. These Ishmaels and Hagars of mankind, in Genesis, Abraham's mistress and her son, Hagar and Ishmael, are driven away by Abraham's wife. Arabs are said to be descendants of Ishmael. Here, Jews are associated with them because generally Ishmael and Hagar are symbols for outcasts. You may recall Moby Dick's opening line, "Call me Ishmael." Some can read this as his proclamation of his status as an outcast. They, the Jews, lived in narrow streets and lanes obscure, ghetto and Judenstrasse, in Mirk and Meyer, the confinement and dirt of the old world. Ghetto is a neighborhood where Jews are allowed to live. It does not have the Holocaust or the African American connotation that the word has today. Judenstrasse means street of the Jews in German, same idea as ghetto. taught in the school of patience to endure the life of anguish and the death of fire. All their lives long, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs of exile and its fears, the speaker takes up elements of the Jewish Passover, the holiday that celebrates the exodus from Egypt. During Passover, religious Jews don't eat leavened bread, that is, they don't eat bread raised by way of yeast. During the Seder dinner, you eat some bitter root to recall the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. He uses these as metaphors, these ceremonies, these religious decrees, as ceremonies for exile in general. So again, he takes the story of Exodus and makes it into a story of exile and maybe death. The wasting famine of the heart they fed, and slaked its thirst with the mara of their tears. Anathema Maratha was the cry that rang from town to town, from street to street. Apparently, anathema maratha is a phrase used in Catholicism to signify excommunication, casting out. This is what Jews hear everywhere in the world. Their sympathy for their role as outcasts, at the same time that the speaker suggests that they don't belong here in America as well. This Latin Catholic phrase also suggests belonging to Europe and its past and not to America and its present, because America is not Catholic, it's Protestant, and it doesn't speak Latin. Speaks English. At every gate, the accused Mordecai was mocked and jeered and spurned by Christian. Pride and humiliation, hand in hand, walked with them through the world wherever they went. Trampled and beaten were they as the sand, and yet unshaken as the continent. Maybe there's some admiration for the Jews who can maintain their sense of identity, pride, even as they were downtrodden. Because in the background, figures vague and vast of patriarchs and of prophets rose sublime, and all the great traditions of the past they saw reflected in the coming time. The power to keep identity, to keep pride, the thing that felt admirable, is again connected to past glories, to the past, to clinging to the past. There is hope for future redemption, but even that is a return to the biblical past where the Jews seem to truly belong. And thus forever, with reverted look, they always look behind their backs to the past, the mystic volume of the world they read, spelling it backward like a Hebrew book. The speaker tells us the Jewish way of thinking is askew, unnatural, backward. Indeed, he compares it to the way Hebrew texts are written from right to left, in a way that's very strange to English readers. So just like history goes from beginning to the end, in reality, the Jews see history backwards. Their perception is all askew, backwards, not working. Till life became a legend of the dead. The result of thinking this way, or at least the end of this backward look, is obsession with the past. The result of this obsession with the past is death. But what once has been shall be no more. As if answering the backward-looking Jews, he asserts that the future return of this glorious past is not possible. The groaning earth in travail and in pain brings forth its races, but does not restore. And the dead nation never rise again. The Jews are a dead nation, even if there are still Jews in the world. Longfellow, a member of the new nation of America, is asserting that the Jews cannot be born again. They will not be redeemed. They belong in the cemetery, he's saying. Even though Longfellow seems to know a lot about Jews and to be moved by their resilience and their pride, he still relegates them to a very specific place. They are not a living nation with whom you can engage as a present reality. Rather, they are a dead nation, symbolized by gravestones. They do not have a room in the United States. As we read work by Jewish writers in this series, maybe keep in mind that this is the kind of stereotype or cultural idea with which Jews need to contend as they carve out room for themselves. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. If you have any other texts you'd like me to discuss, tell me.